Yo, what's up? It's your girl Alana. I'm here to tell y'all that my new single by Curious will be dropping this Friday, June 17th. Make sure y'all tap in and go get that. It will be on all streaming platforms, Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube. Anywhere you want to go, it will be there.
Asking God, please forgive me for my sins. In my bands, talking to myself like Lada, we gon' win. Lost it all and got it back, and now I do it all again. You know I'm different, had to switch it cause these my friends don't call me bougie cause I still be in the hood. If they let me be myself, I promise we gon' still be good. Praying for a new soul, praying for a new pole. Let a nigga try me, I'ma turn him to a I just count the phantom, about to ride it like a new hoe. And you know I'm gifted, young and pretty.
In mid-July 2023, concern began to mount when 26-year-old Bernicia Lightfoot stopped answering her phone. It was her birthday week, an occasion she would never ignore. Known for staying closely connected with friends and family, her sudden silence raised immediate red flags. When she failed to respond for several days, loved ones contacted authorities for a welfare check at her Bedford, Ohio, apartment. Officers who arrived at the scene were met with alarming evidence. Although Bernicia herself was missing, the apartment revealed unsettling signs of violence. Bloodstains and clear indicators of a physical struggle pointed to a potentially serious crime. A missing persons case was promptly launched. Days later, a breakthrough came when Bernicia's cell phone was recovered in Cleveland's Slavic Village, miles from where she lived. The phone had been found near East 64th Street and Francis Avenue, providing a crucial geographic clue. Then, on July 21st, just 3 days after she was reported missing, authorities located human remains in the same area. The body was identified as Bernicia Lightfoot. Her death was ruled a homicide, and the case shifted from a missing person investigation to a murder inquiry. Attention quickly turned to her boyfriend, 31-year-old Michael Rorty Nugent. Already known to police for prior offenses, including domestic violence, drug possession, and firearms violations, Nugent soon became the prime suspect. Early police interviews revealed inconsistencies in his story, and his behavior raised suspicions. He was ultimately arrested and charged with murder. Held at the Cuyahoga County Jail, his bond was set at $2 million. Months of investigation followed. Forensic evidence, GPS data, and witness interviews gradually built a timeline of Bernicia's final days. In a plea agreement, Nugent later admitted guilt to charges of involuntary manslaughter, evidence tampering, and gross abuse of a corpse. In February 2024, he was sentenced to serve between 23 and 28.5 years at Lorain Correctional Institution. The case drew widespread attention in Ohio, not only due to the brutality of the crime, but also because of Bernicia's standing in her community. She wasn't just a victim, she was a respected figure in Bedford. Passionate about public safety, Bernicia co-led the Wolfpack Gunshot Response Team. Her role involved educating youth and community members on life-saving techniques during active shooter situations. She taught emergency first aid, wound compression, and field care in underserved neighborhoods where violence was common. Bernicia was deeply committed to trauma response and community healing, often hosting workshops and leading outreach initiatives focused on survival skills and violence prevention. At the time of her death, Bernicia lived independently in Bedford and maintained regular contact with her family. There were no public reports of her being involved in criminal activity or domestic disputes. There was also no documented history of law enforcement involvement between her and Michael Rorty Nugent prior to her disappearance. Public records confirmed her background was free from controversy, arrests, or criminal associations. Her life reflected that of a dedicated civilian with a strong community presence. Her relationship with Nugent, however, raised serious concerns in hindsight. Although no restraining orders or prior police reports were filed, later interviews with acquaintances painted a disturbing picture. Some described Nugent as controlling and aggressive behind closed doors. Law enforcement used surveillance footage and digital forensics to piece together his movements in the days leading up to Bernicia's murder. Security cameras placed him at her apartment during the time frame she vanished. He was seen leaving the building alone, without Bernicia. Digital evidence strengthened the case. Phone records and location data confirmed Nugent had tampered with Bernacia's cell phone. Authorities discovered he attempted to wipe information from the device before discarding it in Slavic Village. That same neighborhood would later be where Bernacia's body was found. While she had no ties to the area, Nugent had known connections there, creating a direct link between him, the victim's phone, and the dumping site. This case serves as a grim reminder of how domestic violence can escalate, silently and suddenly. Bernacia had no public record of conflict with her partner, yet she became the victim of a crime that shocked her entire community. Despite her involvement in violence prevention, she couldn't escape the one danger closest to her. Her story has left a lasting impact on Bedford and beyond. Bernacia's dedication to protecting others stood in painful contrast to the circumstances of her death. Community members who knew her remember her as compassionate, focused, and determined to make a difference in high-risk neighborhoods. While her professional credentials weren't officially documented, her actions spoke volumes. She worked directly with at-risk youth and families impacted by trauma, bringing life-saving education to the front lines of community safety. Authorities never uncovered signs that Bernacia was in danger prior to her death. There were no warning calls, no filed complaints. But the events of July 2023 changed everything. Her loss exposed the often hidden dynamics of intimate partner violence, how even strong, community-minded individuals can become victims behind closed doors. Her life, work, and the tragic way it ended continue to resonate throughout Bedford and across Ohio. From the initial welfare check to the discovery of her body, every piece of evidence, digital footprints, surveillance footage, and testimonies helped paint a full picture of the crime. And while justice has been served through the legal process, the community continues to mourn the loss of a woman who spent her life trying to save others. Court documents reveal that Michael Rorty Nugent had a history of violent and criminal behavior long before the events of July 2023. In 2018, he was charged with domestic violence involving a separate victim. 2 years later, in 2020, he was arrested for drug trafficking, followed by a 2021 charge for carrying a concealed weapon without proper authorization. Despite these previous offenses, Nugent was not under active supervision or probation at the time of Bernacia Lightfoot's disappearance. No legal restrictions were in place to prevent him from living with or contacting her. Throughout the investigation, those close to Bernacia noted a subtle shift in her behavior leading up to her disappearance. She had begun stepping back from public engagements and reducing communication with certain people. However, there were no official reports or documented signs of physical abuse, and no one close to her had come forward with concerns of violence. Since Nugent eventually admitted guilt in a plea deal, prosecutors didn't present a detailed domestic abuse history in court, eliminating the need for full witness testimony. The chain of events began on July 18, 2023, when officers from the Bedford Police Department responded to a welfare check at Lightfoot's apartment. Family members, increasingly anxious after being unable to reach her by phone or messages, had alerted authorities. When officers entered her home, they discovered signs that something violent had occurred. Items in the apartment were disturbed, and there were traces of what appeared to be blood. But Bernacia was gone. Days later, investigators made a critical discovery. Her cell phone was recovered near East 64th Street and Francis Avenue in Cleveland's Slavic Village, far from where she lived. The location, several miles away, suggested a purposeful attempt to mislead investigators and obscure her whereabouts. On July 21st, a female body was discovered in a wooded, isolated section of the same neighborhood. Forensic analysis later confirmed the remains belonged to Bernacia Lightfoot. The secluded location where her body was found led police to suspect that someone had intentionally placed her there to hinder the investigation. Authorities began reconstructing the timeline between July 18th and July 21st, utilizing phone records, security footage, and eyewitness reports. Their efforts quickly narrowed in on 31-year-old Michael Rorty Nugent, Lightfoot's boyfriend, who was known to have been with her around the time of her last contact. Evidence soon mounted against him. Surveillance videos showed his movements aligning with key moments in the timeline. He was captured near Bernacia's apartment and also near the Slavic village area where her phone and body were discovered. Based on these findings, detectives brought Nugent in for questioning. Discrepancies in his statements, combined with his criminal past and digital footprints, led investigators to believe that Lightfoot had likely died in her apartment and was later transported to the wooded area to conceal the crime. Further investigation uncovered that Nugent had tampered with Lightfoot's phone, attempting to erase its contents before discarding it far from the scene of the murder. This deliberate act strongly indicated an effort to derail investigators and eliminate key evidence. An autopsy later confirmed that Bernacia died from injuries consistent with a violent physical encounter, reinforcing the theory that she had been assaulted in her home before being moved post-mortem. Following the recovery of her remains, investigators increased their focus on Nugent. His narrative did not align with the evidence. Police reviewed his statements, tracking data, and inconsistencies that pointed toward deliberate deception. Cell tower records confirmed that he had been present in both Bedford and Slavic Village within the relevant time frame. Security footage and digital data all placed him near the critical locations associated with Bernacia's final hours. Witness accounts and camera footage further contradicted his earlier claims. By this point, law enforcement had compiled enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant. Nugent was taken into custody and formally charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. His bond was set at $2 million. As prosecutors prepared their case, they uncovered a pattern in Nugent's prior conduct that, while not directly linked to Bernacia's murder, provided a broader context of violent and criminal tendencies. With mounting evidence, the pressure on Nugent grew. Eventually, he accepted a plea deal that reduced his charges. On February 28, 2024, he pleaded guilty to 3 felonies: involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. As part of the agreement, the initial murder charge was dropped. The court accepted the plea, avoiding a jury trial. Under Ohio law, involuntary manslaughter refers to causing someone's death during the commission of a felony. Prosecutors successfully demonstrated that enough evidence existed to support this charge. The tampering count reflected Nugent's efforts to eliminate or relocate physical evidence, while the charge related to gross abuse of a corpse referred to how Bernacia's body had been moved and left in an abandoned location. At sentencing, the court considered Nugent's prior felony convictions involving drugs and weapons. These past offenses were used by the prosecution to argue for the highest possible penalty within the scope of the plea agreement. The judge ultimately sentenced him to serve between 23 and 28.5 years in prison, and he was transferred to Lorain Correctional Institution to begin his term. Legal proceedings against Nugent progressed swiftly following his arrest. Pre-trial hearings included the review of extensive digital evidence, forensic reports, and surveillance records. Prosecutors used this material to build a coherent and corroborated timeline that demonstrated his involvement in Bernacia's death. Investigators submitted supporting documents, including findings from Lightfoot's recovered phone and physical evidence from her apartment, all of which were included in the probable cause affidavit presented to the court. Rather than go through a prolonged trial, Nugent's legal counsel entered into negotiations with the prosecution. The agreement allowed both parties to avoid presenting graphic details or calling witnesses to the stand. During the hearing, the court confirmed that Nugent understood the nature of the plea and the consequences involved. The sentence was handed down as agreed, closing the case without further delay or appeals. Since the court's decision, no additional suspects have been named, and no further legal motions have been filed. The case was officially closed shortly after sentencing, and authorities have not indicated the presence of any accomplices or co-defendants in the crime. After the tragic passing of Bernacia Lightfoot and the subsequent arrest of her boyfriend, Michael Rorty Nugent, the communities of Bedford and Cleveland were left reeling. Bernicia had been active in several local outreach initiatives, particularly those centered on emergency trauma response and youth safety. Her sudden disappearance and the confirmation of her death sent shockwaves through the circles she worked in, prompting a series of memorials and public responses. In the wake of her confirmed homicide, both cities saw coordinated vigils and remembrance events. These gatherings involved a broad spectrum of participants, including residents, nonprofit organizers, and civic leaders who came together to honor her life and service. Local news stations covered the memorials extensively, with one quote gaining traction. "The young man got what he deserved," referring to the sentence handed down to Rorty Nugent. That phrase was shared widely on social media, amplifying public interest and reactions to the case outcome. Though opinions varied slightly, the general sentiment across the community was one of agreement with the court's resolution. Many residents used social media to document the case's progression, from Nugent's arrest to his plea deal and eventual sentencing. Discussions also expanded beyond this singular crime. Many individuals began talking more openly about intimate partner violence, the signs often missed, and the importance of speaking up when things seem off. While no official awareness campaign was launched directly from the case, it did inspire informal digital discussions around relationship red flags, coercive behavior, and community vigilance. Throughout the early stages of the investigation, members of the public played a crucial role. They provided information regarding Brenicia's last known whereabouts, observations of Nugent's behavior, and movements that later helped authorities build a solid timeline. These contributions proved vital in narrowing the focus and strengthening the case against the suspect. News coverage remained consistent even after the arrest. Reporters frequently returned to the affected neighborhoods, speaking with those who had worked with or known Benicia. Her story became an anchor for broader conversations about violence in relationships and the importance of early intervention. It also highlighted the role communities play in keeping cases like this visible until justice is served. The widespread attention this case received didn't translate into legislative change, but it did underscore an essential truth. Public engagement is key to resolving missing persons cases, especially those with domestic violence implications. The ongoing involvement of Brenicia's community helped bring clarity and closure, contributing both to the investigation and to the accurate retelling of her story. Once sentencing concluded, the legal phase officially came to an end. Rorty Nugent was sentenced to serve between 23 and 28.5 years at Lorain Correctional Institution. There were no appeals or pending charges, and prosecutors closed the file. Focus then shifted toward the broader impact the case had on both local institutions and law enforcement practices. From a procedural standpoint, officials pointed to this case as a successful model for interagency collaboration. Bedford and Cleveland law enforcement worked in tandem using surveillance footage, digital trails, and physical evidence to establish a seamless narrative from disappearance to conviction. Their coordinated efforts were later used in internal assessments as examples of how to manage missing person cases that evolve into homicide investigations. Brenicia's absence also affected the operations of the outreach groups she had supported. She had served in a leadership capacity with the Wolfpack Gunshot Response Team, a program designed to prepare young people for emergency medical situations. Her sudden loss left a noticeable void, prompting a reshuffle of responsibilities and reducing the team's capacity to deliver trauma response education. Though the initiative remains functional, internal reports noted a decline in youth engagement and training depth following her death. As of mid-2025, no official nonprofit or memorial organization has been established in Brenicia's name. However, former team members and community peers have floated ideas aimed at preserving her legacy. These include workshop series centered on domestic safety awareness, emotional preparedness, and trauma response, continuing the type of work Benicia was so passionate about during her life. Law enforcement agencies also used the case as a training tool. Various elements from the investigation, such as missing person tracking, offender digital behavior, and the use of public tips, are now part of instructional materials in local police academies and internal departmental briefings. Specific case elements have been anonymized and added to classroom exercises for officers in training, offering real-world insight into how domestic homicide cases can unfold and be resolved. According to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, Rory Nugent will be reviewed for parole based on his conduct during incarceration, his minimum sentencing period, and applicable legal statutes. So far, no parole requests or early release filings have been submitted on his behalf. Beyond the immediate legal outcome, the case has spurred renewed attention to how individuals with violent histories are monitored once released into society. Discussions have emerged regarding how often domestic violence offenders go unchecked in relationships lacking official intervention or restraining orders. Analysts have cited the Brenacia Lightfoot case in exploring the value of plea agreements when direct evidence of premeditated murder is limited. In Nugent's case, the shift from murder to involuntary manslaughter allowed for a conviction and substantial prison term without requiring a full jury trial. Brenacia's name now appears in multiple domestic violence databases across the state. Advocacy groups and public policy researchers reference her case when compiling data on fatal outcomes in intimate relationships. Her story, beginning with a sudden disappearance and ending in a successful prosecution, is being used to teach not only police officers but also the broader public about the dangers of unrecognized abuse. The community's response, the legal resolution, and the ongoing influence of Brenacia's life and legacy illustrate how one tragic case can ripple across systems, from law enforcement and legal strategy to education, advocacy, and public awareness. Her death, while heartbreaking, has prompted meaningful reflection in the communities she touched and continues to inspire safety conversations long after the headlines faded. And that brings us to the end of today's case. But remember, this is just one of many untold stories waiting to be brought to light. At True Crimes Venue, we're committed to uncovering the facts, giving a voice to the silenced, and keeping their stories alive. If you found this case eye-opening, there's more on the way. Stories that will shock you, disturb you, and most importantly, make you think. Be sure to check out our well-curated playlist, linked in the description, for more real-life crime stories. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and remember, justice always starts with truth.